Hello and welcome to Sunday Chat for the fourth Sunday in Ordinary Time, which happens to be February 3rd, 2019. And our readings for this coming Sunday are interesting in that they bring together prophecy and love. And one might ask, well, what is the connection? In fact, at first glance, one might imagine that perhaps those who compiled the liturgical readings made a mistake, or else a happy error. But they do belong together, and I'd like to explain why. At least I think they belong together. First of all, let's start with the prophetic. We have in our first reading from Jeremiah the call of Jeremiah the prophet, and God called Jeremiah before his conception, before he was even in the womb. So that is pretty much a remarkable calling, pre-existence, you might say. And then we have Jesus in the Gospel from Luke 4, as the rejected prophet in his hometown of Nazareth. So there is Jesus who basically lets the people know that he knows their secret thoughts, and that he realizes that they don't quite believe that he is all that they hear he is to be, and also that they're looking for some kind of proof. Just as he has performed miracles already in Capernaum, so they too are expecting him to perform similar miracles in Nazareth, and instead he critiques them for their way of thinking, referring to historical events, or biblical events, one might say, in which prophets, instead of being welcomed in their hometown, performed miracles elsewhere, or were sent elsewhere. So then we have, in the middle of these two prophetic texts, we have the wonderful Pauline treatise on love, in which St. Paul presents the way of love that we know so well. And in its abbreviated form, 1 Corinthians chapter 13 begins, "Love is patient, love is kind," though of course before that we have the text which it warns us that even if we have gifts of prophecy, even if we are able to discern tongues or speak in tongues, yet love is the greatest gift of all, and not to be proud of other gifts that we might have. So again, how do we relate the texts? Again, I want to begin with the prophets, and to do so I'm going to be drawing on Abraham Heschel's book, Volume 1, The Prophets. I'm referring to this book because it was so influential on me so many years ago. You can perhaps see that the pages are very yellowed, and I've underlined many passages. I'm not sure anymore what is my thinking and what is Heschel's thinking, so I'm just going to attribute it all to Heschel, and if I falsely attribute something, then please know that it's goodwill on my part, and not an attempt to put words into Heschel's mouth that may not have been there. But I will speak about the prophetic as I understand it, and again acknowledge that a lot of my understanding has been shaped by Abraham Heschel. In the first place, the prophet is somebody who loves, which might sound interesting, because when we think of the prophetic, we often think of prophets railing and screaming at the people, or telling them of the dire doom that's about to fall upon them. And yes, the prophets do that, but they speak always from the position of love. And they speak from the position of God's love for humanity, and their own personal love for humanity. They represent God and they represent humanity. And if I'm not mistaken, Heschel said something to the effect that the prophet holds God and humanity in a single thought. That basically the prophet is caught between the two, between being human and representing the divine. And so the prophet's interests are to bring the two together, to reconcile the human and the divine, and to bring God's compassion and love, even while he, the prophet, or she, the prophet, may be screaming and railing about doom to come and punishment to come. So then the prophet is somebody who loves and speaks out of love. And the prophet is also somebody in love with God. The prophet is one who understands the pathos of God, that God is indeed capable of suffering, and that the infidelity of the people, the wayward actions of the people, the crimes of the people, the mistreatment of the poor, all these strike the divine heart in ways that are painful and cruel. And I think from the refrain from the prophet Isaiah, where God says, "My people, O my people, what have I done to thee? Or what more could I have done for you?" And so then we have the pathos of God coming through then these prophetic texts in a way that's pretty powerful. So the prophet then is in love with God and in love with humanity, and as such speaks for both. So again, how do we fit these texts together? Well, the text on love is Paul's text is Paul's love letter to the wayward community of Corinth, where many aberrations have happened, liturgical aberrations, ethical aberrations. The people have celebrated the Eucharist while drunk. They have not reached out to the poor. All kinds of things going on in Corinth, including a failure to censor somebody who is in an incestuous relationship. But Paul speaks from the vantage point of love, not condemnation. And his task is not to shame, but rather to teach and to present the possibility of God's saving grace to the people, even as they stray from that grace. So where does this leave us, the believing community? We're listening to the prophetic text, we're listening to a text on love. What does it say to us? Well, in the first place, all of us are called to be prophets. This is a cliche these days, but it's a cliche with truth, because our understanding of baptism since the Second Vatican Council in the 1960s was that baptism is to anoint all people as priests, prophets, and kings, regardless of whether they end up being ordained or not, that every Christian by baptism is ordained as a prophet. And so all of us then are called to be prophetic, and this means speaking out in love. Speaking out in love when it may be unpopular to do so. I think back to the Gulf War, when people who opposed the Gulf War were accused of being unpatriotic. The same thing happened when people opposed the war in Iraq under George W. Bush. And the reason for that war in Iraq was supposedly the discovery of weapons of mass destruction, which actually never existed. And those who spoke out and protested against this war were basically again labeled as unpatriotic. And so then anyone who spoke out against this war was basically treated as a traitor, as being unpatriotic, as being against the American flag, against American values. And there were real attacks on anyone who spoke out against this reality. And yet those who did speak out were the prophets. So we have then the idea that each of us is called to speak out in love, whether it's critiquing the government for a war that's unpopular or unjustified, or whether it's people, members of the church, who speak out against paedophilia in the church, and those who initially did so in the very first days when the paedophilia began coming to light. In the 1990s, if I'm not mistaken, I think it was that far back when the first cases were being discussed in the news, that anyone who came forward as a victim or to file a complaint was treated as a heretic, as anti-religion, as anti-God, and the victims were doubly victimized. So rather than being listened to, they were greeted with condemnation for speaking their truth. So that again is an example of the prophetic voice being silenced, even though those who spoke out did so in love of the church, love of justice, love of wanting an end to practices which would harm future children in the church. And then we just have to think about, on a more domestic level, when we chastise a child, obviously not going overboard, but there's a need to offer critique, there's a need to point out to a child that he or she is going on the wrong path. That is also done in love, and so one is being prophetic. Parents and godparents and grandparents are being prophetic when they speak truth to children in their lives. Teachers as well, in pointing out to children that there's a different path that they might take. And then one more example where a truth can be difficult but is also spoken in love is when family members or friends intervene on the part of somebody who's gripped in addiction, whether it's alcoholism or drug addiction, and they seek an intervention to help this family member or friend who cannot make it on his or her own. And again, that may be perceived as being disloyal to the person in question, but ultimately it's a prophetic voice spoken in love. So as I think about St. Paul's text on love is patient, love is kind, we see that this is prophetic. To love is a prophetic action. To really love involves not only human love, but it takes us to the realm of supernatural love. To love in the way that St. Paul describes, we need to love as God loves. Our hearts need to be like the divine heart. We need to see with the divine eyes so we can feel with the divine heart, and then we'll be able to love in a way that is completely loving, giving, and redemptive. So that's my take on love and prophecy. I hope I've made a good case, thanks to Abraham Heschel and whatever I remember from his wonderful book, The Prophets, Volume 1. And I hope that these thoughts will carry you into the next week. So checking out from a very cold Chicago, where we're in the middle of a polar vortex, this is Sunday Chat for yet another week.